Happy Friday to one and all. This is episode 69 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this yet another rainy day, rainy evening here in New York. If you're checking out this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoying the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. Or if you're catching up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify, iTunes, and the rest, haven't done so already, and are enjoying the content, click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. So today marks 99 years since the birth of Paul Newman, who is one of those legendary names in Hollywood, not just because of his talents as an actor, producer, filmmaker. He actually drew an Oscar nomination for Best Director for a movie called Rachel. Paul Newman was so much more than just an actor, good-looking kid with the most striking blue eyes that people had ever seen up to that point. He was a humanitarian, and even though he's been gone, more than 15 years, his legacy lives on in the form of not only the products you still see in stores. There are a lot of people, it's kind of like George Foreman with the grills, that a generation of people don't know that George Foreman, he was a boxer. He was one of the great boxers. He was an Olympic champion. He was a two-time heavyweight champion. I only knew he was a grill guy. There are people who probably, and this is not a criticism, this is just a reality of what we know, what we absorb. And when we see something and don't question it, we make assumptions. We all do it. So if somebody is in the supermarket, is in a store, and they see among the salad dressing, or it could be pasta sauce or salsa or whatever it might be, and they see a brand called Newman's Own, they might not say, well, I wonder who this guy is. He's a guy. He has a company that makes different kinds of food. But Paul Newman, the Paul Newman Foundation, have donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charity since, the inception of the food company, especially in 1982. It's been estimated that more than $600 million has been given to worthwhile charities. And that's just extraordinary. There are charitable people, there are giving people. Newman just seems as if he was on another level. It seems as if that was his life's work. Not just being an actor, a movie star, somebody who traveled the world because of his position in Hollywood. And it's unfortunate that he died. He wasn't that old. He was in his early 80s when he passed. What was he, 80? He was 82, going on 83. I think he was 83. But hell, 83 isn't that old. And he was somebody who lived a healthy life. He was always into fitness. And there are even later movies with him where you see just how fit he was. And to be specific, one of the Coen brothers' sort of lesser-known films, it came out right around the same time as The Shawshank Redemption. And the reason why I said Shawshank is because it stars Tim Robbins. It's called The Hudsucker Proxy. And Newman plays a kind of smiling, somewhat villainous character. It's not really a movie with, horrendous villains. But there's a scene in that film where Newman, who is pushing 70, still got washboard abs. This was a guy who lived a healthy lifestyle for his entire life. Now, you could argue that all the race car driving was the antithesis of health. He was a fantastic race car driver. He had his own racing team, and Tom Cruise famously raced for Newman's team. And Cruise was another guy who, if he hadn't been an actor, he may have been a champion race car driver because he picked up car racing so quickly. He was so damn good at it. The movie Days of Thunder, Cruise was already a quote-unquote successful driver in his own right when he starred in that movie. So Newman, of course, began as just an actor. But he started getting Oscar nominations pretty soon and pretty early in his career. And it's not something that you think of, but he was in his early 30s when, for example, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, that was one of the first sort of huge movies. Now, he did Somebody Up There Likes Me when he was about 29 going on 30. And that is a boxing biopic on the order of a Raging Bull or an Ali. It's funny, there hasn't been a Sugar Ray Robinson biopic of any note. But Somebody Up There Likes Me was a key film for Newman as far as, like, he just went from very not known and little known to all of a sudden, wow, huge star. And unfortunately, he got that role. He got that superstar fomenting role of Rocky Graziano in Somebody Up There Likes Me because James Dean died in a car crash. That was a role that was James Dean. It was going to be James Dean. And when James Dean passed, I mean, what was Newman going to do? Turn it down on ceremony? You got to work. You got to take your shot when you get your shot. And honestly, the acting styles were so much different. You know, James Dean was an old school method actor where he would have these unbelievable wellsprings of emotion, remembering past traumas and whatever it was. Newman was a more reactive performer. Whether or not he studied Stanislavski or the method, just in terms of how he came across, those were two actors who were, you know, the irony is that Paul Newman was about 6 years. Paul Newman's like 6 years or 5 years, I believe 6 years older than James Dean. That's how crazy it is. That's how young James Dean was when he died. He was 24. James Dean is younger than Clint Eastwood, for crying out loud. Clint Eastwood's still around. James Dean's been gone since 1955. September 30, 1955. But that was a kind of key film that put Paul Newman over the top very early in his career. Like, there are certain people who, you know, like Clint Eastwood, who worked in Hollywood for quite some time and then was a TV star and then became a movie star. Paul Newman hit, and he would kind of put over, to use wrestling terminology, real quick. And, you know, his first Oscar nomination, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which, hey, stage plays are tough. They're not so easy. And that is a really good adaptation of Tennessee Williams' play. Because the play, I read it, I think the movie is better than the play. The play is kind of stodgy. And I don't just mean because, well, of course it's stodgy, you fucking idiot, it's a play. But the movie does things while staying as true as possible to the spirit of what Tennessee Williams was going for. Even though they kind of tap dance around, you know, the sort of forbidden homosexual angle in the play, they do it in such a way that you get it without, they didn't have to break any rules back then. Again, it's 1959. You didn't have to say the quiet part out loud. Audiences are smart. You don't always have to kind of bludgeon them into saying, oh, this is what this is really about. I get it now. You know, on a subtle way, okay, I think I see what's going on here. You know, it's fine. But Newman, not every star had his path just in terms of the kinds of roles he played. But if you sort of, and there's way too many great movies and great performances to sit here, you know, laying them all out for you. But he aged very gracefully. And the one thing is, now, he was a man who had a certain level of vanity. There's no question. He knew that he didn't look like a normal person, that he was freakishly good looking. And he took care of himself. He was a big exercise person. You can find pictures of him as a very young man. And as I say, even into his 60s, where he looks like an athlete. He was small. This was not a guy who lifted weights. He didn't lift weights even to the level of, you know, like, for example, a Clint Eastwood, who you can find pictures of Clint when he was in his 40s and 50s. And you'll say, you know, he actually was a little bit more diesel than I thought. You know, Clint was just a big man. Newman was small of build, but very solid. And he was a fitness enthusiast. He was a guy who really tried to take care of himself to kind of preserve his looks for as long as possible. But he also didn't go the route of, and this is not really a criticism, this is a Hollywood reality. He didn't go the route of like the Burt Lancaster or Charlton Heston, who started coloring their hair to try to play younger roles for as long as possible. And Roger Ebert, the late great film critic who I've talked about repeatedly because I feel like he's the most accessible of the film critics. He didn't just rank movies. He talked about stars. He interviewed stars. And he's written a lot on how Paul Newman was more willing than most big stars. Like, it's another thing, like, for example, Sean Connery. Sean Connery's hair went when he was very young. And there are certain roles that he played with a hairpiece, but he didn't do it for other roles other than James Bond because he was just about the least vain of stars. Hey, this is who I am. This is where I am at this point in my life. What can I do? And in the case of Paul Newman, he did not scramble to color his hair, because if you look at early movies of Newman in the 60s, his hair went gray really young. You see him in movies like even this Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where Newman was like 41 and 42 during production. His hair is more than flecked with gray. There's a lot of gray in there. And then you go forward, and there are some movies where maybe they colored it a little bit, but there are just as many films where you see, geez, he kind of looks old. And how old is he here? I don't know, he's like 41. Holy shit. Other actors would have immediately gone to the stylist and said, get rid of this fucking gray. But honestly, the salt and pepper, there are pictures of him with the beard and shots of him when he was overseas, the kind of some famous pictures of him in a boat showing off his, $200,000 Rolex or whatever it was. It worked for him. And he was not overly preoccupied with how old he looked. And what I was saying about Ebert, the movie The Verdict, which is a courtroom, not really a thriller. To call it a courtroom thriller would be a stretch. The Rainmaker is closer to a courtroom thriller because there's more potential risk of like disbarment or injury or death that somebody might try to bump him off. But The Verdict had Paul Newman, who was in his mid-50s, and I feel like he was playing older. And this is something that his contemporary, Clint Eastwood, did, where Clint was not afraid to play older. And most of the major stars, as I say, the Lancasters and Hestons, even to some extent Robert Mitchum and Richard Widmark and guys in that ballpark, always tried to play younger. Hell, even Cary Grant. The Cary Grant was Cary Grant. I'm not even going to, that's never going to drag Cary Grant here. But in the movie The Verdict, Newman is playing a beaten down warhorse of an attorney, a guy who was very talented and has basically drank away his career and has not had the career. And he's supposed to be older than his actual age. And that is something that stars of Newman's magnitude, generally speaking, and look at even today, it's usually not done. He didn't care. He was only concerned with the movie and the story and what can we do here. And I will say this, my dad, may he rest in peace, The Verdict was his favorite Paul Newman movie. More so than all the classics, because when people, in general, when people like me are asked, name your 5 favorite Paul Newman films, not in any order. Now, it's not always easy when you have a career like that, but I would go The Hustler, Cool Hand Luke. I'll say The Color of Money just because him and Cruise are so good together. And I really like Road to Perdition. That was his last Oscar nomination for supporting actor. That's the Tom Hanks film. So I love that Newman was around long enough to make movies with Tom Hanks. And he and Hanks had a lot of scenes. They had to have spent a lot of time together. Sam Mendes' Road to Perdition adaptation of I believe it was a graphic novel. And Tom Cruise, who became very, very close. And Newman was kind of like a father figure. But I love Road to Perdition. I love The Sting. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is an all-timer. It's not in my top 5 all-time Westerns. I'm more of an old school type of a Western guy. And honestly, it's such a difficult thing. How does one compare The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? They're both Westerns, and they're both classics. They're both the kinds of movies that will show up regularly on best Westerns lists by people like me and people like, film critics at large. But they're in the same genre, and it could even be the same time period, but they have nothing in common. Nothing. Other than that they might be set in the American West. Well, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is actually set in Italy, which is supposed to be the American West, but that's something else. But Newman, those would be my 5 Paul Newman films. So The Verdict doesn't make my top 5. And he showed up. It's almost impossible. You can't find a Paul Newman film performance where you don't see the gears grinding, even in a small role as the father in Message in a Bottle. Kevin Costner, another huge star that adored Paul Newman. They made the movie, which was a romance, and Newman just chewing scenery, just loving every minute of it, even though he wasn't really the star. The last film that Paul Newman was in as star, I saw in theaters. And people get mixed up because the movie is called Twilight, but it has nothing to do with the Twilight series. It's an old school, old-fashioned mystery with romance elements, noir elements, and a little bit of thriller elements. And Reese Witherspoon, who was on her way up, Reese was on the rise. She was about 21 or 22 when this was shot. This is, before Legally Blonde. It's even before Election, which was a big one for her. But I saw Nobody's Fool, which was Paul Newman's last Best Actor, not supporting, but Best Actor nomination. I saw it in theaters. Another great cast. Bruce Willis, Melanie Griffith. It's not a great movie. That's a movie where Newman was playing younger. In real life, he was pushing 70, and his character, Sully, is supposed to be 60. But he looks every bit of his age. And we're supposed to believe that this guy has had kind of a rough life. He's hobbling around. He's got one bad knee, and the other knee is bad. And he doesn't have a great relationship with his son or his grandkid. And Melanie Griffith wants to have an affair with him. It's a good movie. It's a kind of a gentle, whimsical sort of story. And I kind of wanted him to win Best Actor for Nobody's Fool, or Morgan Freeman for Shawshank. And because I love Tom Hanks, but I thought that Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, I think was just really great what he did. Even though I know he's playing humble good guy and the typical Hanks character that is just a really good soul and a good human being. Like there's really not much shadings to that character. And and Forrest Gump is, for what he is steadfast. Like it's not a broad performance in terms of character growth, I don't feel. But that's neither here nor there. I love Tom Hanks, but there was a part of me that was hoping that Newman would win the Oscar for Nobody's Fool. And everybody said, no, it's just Hanks' year. And you can make the argument. If you ask me, what do I think is the strongest performance Hanks gave? I love what he does in Castaway. I feel like no other actor at that time could have approached what Hanks did there. Basically, talking a fucking volleyball and making you believe it. I love Hanks in Apollo 13. I think that might be some of his best film acting, the way that he comes across. And, actors have moments that we remember, individual moments. And for Hanks, people remember, Houston, we have a problem. But my Hanks moment from that film is at the end, when they're getting ready for re-entry, and there's every chance that they're going to burn up and they're all going to be dead. The way that Hanks, they're all exhausted, they're all beat up. In the case of Bill Paxton as Fred Hayes, he's practically dying from an infection. The way that Hanks says, "It's been a privilege flying with you." That may be my single favorite Tom Hanks moment. As far as Paul Newman, my single favorite Paul Newman moment is in the movie The Sting, when he somehow out-cheats a cheater at poker. And that's one of the 10 best scenes in any movie I've ever seen, because I still don't have any idea how the fuck he does it, and that's kind of the point. But Newman worked steadily, and there are very few periods in his career where he was not doing quality work. And there were plenty of movies that kind of underperformed at the box office, the 70s through the 80s. And a little trivia that some of you maybe don't know, Oppenheimer, however, it's being pronounced on a certain day. I just say Oppenheimer. I think of the financial company, Oppenheimer, the right way to invest. But Paul Newman was in a movie about the same stuff. I shouldn't say stuff, it's too serious, but the same real life events that are chronicled in Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. It's called Fat Man and Little Boy. And again, for those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, think of the Matt Damon character, Leslie Groves. That's who Paul Newman played in Fat Man and Little Boy. And Dwight Schultz, he kind of looked like the real J. Robert Oppenheimer, and I feel like that's why they cast him. Dwight Schultz had been a TV star, famously on The A-Team, with George Papard and Mr. T. I pity the fool. Fat Man and Little Boy did not do that well with critics and audiences. You can find it on streaming. It's absolutely worth seeing. If you're a fan of Oppenheimer, just compare what he does to what Damon does. Now, Fat Man and Little Boy focuses more on Groves than Oppenheimer. It's a totally different kind of a film. But in that movie, Newman is really grinding. And then he did a film with his wife, like the longest showbiz marriage in history, Joanne Woodward. Another movie my dad was a fan of, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. Nobody went to see it. And that's the way it goes. And look, the Coen brothers' Hudsucker Proxy underperformed. That was considered a box office disappointment. but he kept working and he kept being a mensch, to use a great Yiddish word. The charitable giving never stopped. And in fact, it accelerated. He just kept giving. He kept grinding, trying to come up with new products that could turn a profit so that they could just keep giving more and more. He had a ranch, which I want to say was not just, it was underprivileged kids, but I want to say it was something similar to what Don Imus did, the late Don Imus, the famous kind of shock jock who also, I shouldn't say also, but who had a heart, the Imus Ranch. But I think the Hole in the Wall Ranch was for children trying to overcome cancer, just horrible stuff. And this was something that was very near and dear to Newman throughout his life. And there was like it's not really a joke, but J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, he allegedly had this enemies list. And there were some really shitty people on the enemies list, but allegedly Paul Newman was on the enemies list. And Newman kind of half-jokingly said, if I'm on his enemies list, I feel like I must be doing something right. He really had no use. He thought Hoover was a fucking clown and overreaching and all of that. But he always tried to live his life a certain way. And there are plenty of people in Hollywood that put forth an image, and the reality is totally different. Not always, but in a case of Newman, and the closest approximation that I can find is someone who never worked with Paul Newman, but Audrey Hepburn. And to be more specific, I have never read anything with anybody in the movie business saying something negative about Audrey Hepburn. Never. Never. No one. And you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who worked with Newman or knew him well taking shots at him. Yeah, he sucked. What a phony. What a piece of crap. Everybody. And not just the people who knew him well. People who, in some cases, worked briefly with him. It's kind of like, you know, and there's a changing of the guard. And then, as Clint Eastwood said, at a certain point in time, you become part of a landscape. And Paul Newman, I watched an interview he did many, many years ago on a talk show. It's got to be at least 20, maybe even back in the days when he was promoting the movie Twilight, which is now a film that's 26 years old, where he's talking about working with Orson Welles, with the Orson Welles. Now, Orson Welles, if he were still around, would be, how old would he be? He'd be over 100 himself. He'd be like 108, 110, because Welles was not very old when he died. I think he'd be about 108, yeah. Welles was only 70. Was he 70 when he passed? He looked older. He didn't live very well. But to hear Paul Newman 25 years ago talking about working with Orson Welles and shooting the shit with Orson Welles and the crazy life stories that Orson Welles shared with him. Well, Paul Newman, I'm sure, had a lot of crazy life stories. But he was asked, what do you think about Orson Welles? He said he was fucking brilliant. Everything you ever imagined about that guy was true. He was diabolical. But you just knew. You looked at that man. You listened to him speak. Wow. So Newman did slow down. You know, he did a movie with Linda Fiorentino. I think it was around 2000. It wasn't that good. He plays it like an old school bank robber who wants one last score. It was called Where the Money Is. You know, the famous Willie Sutton. Why do you want to rob banks? Because that's where the money is. His last screen appearance was an HBO miniseries, which I have not seen. I believe it's with Ed Harris, and it got a lot of acclaim. I think there were some Emmy and Globe nominations. It's called Empire Falls. And then he made an appearance, well, more than an appearance, he's one of the voices in the original movie Cars, which is not a coincidence given his love of racing and the respect that he engendered within the film industry, that they would go to him and say, hey, Paul's been kind of quiet. How's his health? Because he was around 80 at the time that he recorded his lines for Cars. And so his last real meaty role was Road to Perdition, where if it's possible to play an affable mob boss, he kind of does that. And, you know, that's a film, speaking about Tom Hanks in this movie, we've seen Hanks play so many guys with very clear moral centers, not moral centers where you have to search, but clearly defined point A, point B, point C from a character perspective. And I remember when American Beauty came out and was this huge success and ended up winning a ton of acclaim, Best Picture, and, you know, Sam Mendes, the filmmaker, and Kevin Spacey for Best Actor. Hanks said something, and I remember reading this, and I was shocked because my expectations of Tom Hanks were that he would always only play these kinds of roles. He said, I wish that I had, like, no offense to Spacey, at the time, Spacey was not the kind of pariah he would later become. He said something like, no offense to Spacey, but I do wish that I had been given the chance because I love that script and I would have really liked a chance to try that because it would have been something different than what I had done. So Road to Perdition was Tom Hanks playing a character, which, as he said, this character, Michael Sullivan, he has a moral center. He is not a soulless criminal, but he is somebody who made a decision at a certain point in his life. If I have to commit murder to give my family a nice house and any kind of a life, I'm going to do it. And so that's a story where, a movie where Newman is, yes, he's trading on the audience knowing who he is. You could watch it now, and I'm sure there are plenty of people under 30 who have seen that movie and it didn't click to them and they didn't Google it or understand the weight that Paul Newman brings to every moment where he's on screen. It's decades etched on his face. A movie star. One last great role. Man, I wanted him to win for supporting actor. But you know what? He got his best actor for The Color of Money in a movie that is, I love it. It's Tom Hanks' movie. I've talked about that. That's not the movie that you would want Paul Newman to win his best actor Oscar for. Better if it had been The Verdict, where he would have earned the fuck out of it. Or even The Sting, where he's fucking incredible in The Sting. He's so good. But that's beside the point. Road to Perdition, what Newman does with his eyes, with his body, and the fact that his character is the kind of, everybody likes him, he's a man of the town, just don't piss him off, don't cross him. Because if he has to scramble to defend himself and his family, even if he has issues with his son's Daniel Craig before James Bond, fantastic in that movie. Wow, is he good. But it was a different role for Hanks. And, if somebody were to talk about how Hanks is predictable and that he always plays the same kind of character, if they're not familiar with Road to Perdition, it is some of Hanks's finest work because you still get the glimmers of the humble good guy, Tom Hanks, but you're not expecting him to just say, you know what? There are a bunch of people that are going to try to kill my son. I'm going to defend my son to my last breath and beyond. So here I am. You know that I'm good at this. You come after me. It's almost like, Heat, De Niro and Pacino. Let's say you do got me boxed and I got to put you down because I will not hesitate for a second. That's Tom Hanks in Road to Perdition. It is a different Tom Hanks. And I like to say he brings out the best in Newman in that movie. Newman brings out the best in him. Because Newman didn't always play conventional leads, humble good guys. He played a lot of heels. The movie HUD, another of his Oscar nominations, this guy's a fucking scumbag. He sucks. He was willing to do things that made him look, hell, Towering Inferno. Supposedly he and McQueen had issues because they both wanted top billing. Truth be told, that's Steve McQueen's movie. Newman is the star for the first hour. He doesn't have anything to do. The building is burning. What good is the architect going to do? Nothing. But he made movies like that. He worked with Hitchcock. He worked with everybody. Scorsese. He had the opportunity to make so many different kinds of movies and span the generations. And for all the Oscar nominations, I feel like, and for the money and the career, it's what he was able to do with the money. He gave to this day more than $600 million, as I say, through the foundation. But he donated just out of pocket. He withdrew $21 million and donated it directly to various charities which had kind of gotten the thumbs up that were said to be worthwhile. Because we know there's a lot of charity fraud and all kinds of stuff. So he was being, even at the end of his life, and it couldn't have been good, he, dying of lung cancer. I can't imagine what it was like to have lived the life he lived and then to suffer. He probably suffered unmercifully the last year of his life, but he still was all about using his own moral center, trying to do the right thing. And I don't believe that he was worried about what other people thought of him. I feel that he really was as grounded and centered as he seemed to be. I think that he was exactly how we saw him. You know, there really haven't been any stories of, you know, that 15 kids with 12. There's very little of scandal in his life. The son that he had from his first marriage died young of a drug overdose, and that might be the worst tragedy that he absorbed as a person, as a father, as a family man. I can't even imagine what that was like. That was in the late 70s. But, you know, as you say, he continued to work, and he continued to kind of grind and put back and give back and do as much as he could for all of his days to give back. And he didn't seem to have any regrets. Towards the end, there was nothing of him complaining. He wanted to die at home, and he died quietly at age, I think, as I say, age 83. And here we are all these years later, and the Newman's own product line is still thriving. And they're really good. You know, the pasta sauce is terrific. The salad dressing, so we kind of joke around, say, are you a fan of Paul Newman? And you'd be surprised how many people immediately say, I love the salad dressings. Not, I love the movies. Yeah, Slapshot. From the sports film perspective, there's a movie that will make a lot of top tens. Newman as a kind of graying, older hockey player. And everybody's, oh, the Hanson brothers. I like Slapshot. I don't love it. But so many great movies, so many great performances, and so much of an ability to hold the camera just at gaze, similar to John Wayne, similar to Clint Eastwood, even Harrison Ford to some extent. Hell, Mel Gibson. Not everybody has that gift to be able to be the only thing that the audience sees. There could be multiple people on screen, but your attention were always drawn to Paul Newman because he just had that special movie star charisma. That's something that can't be taught. You either got it or you don't. And he had it. And on top of that, he was a really talented actor. He was they used to say he was giving, that he was good with other actors. He gave people room. But when he's on screen with someone else, generally speaking, your eyes are drawn to him. He's Paul Newman. You know, Robert Shaw was a fierce, intimidating presence in The Sting. And this was the Robert Shaw just before Jaws. Yeah, maybe a year and a half before he began shooting Jaws. And man, Newman just owns it. The poker scene where they're playing, and you know that Robert Shaw is cheating. You don't know that Paul Newman has literally another jack up his sleeve. And I would say, and I like to do this for fans who are maybe only familiar with a few, because my guess is that the average person, certainly they know his voice from Cars. Like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that was this famous guy playing that voice role. There are people who have probably seen him in Road to Perdition. But if somebody asked me, and I'll close on this, give me a couple of Paul Newman movies that, for somebody that's not familiar with any of his work, that will work. Guaranteed, The Sting. The Sting to me is number one, because even though that movie is 50 years old, it's a period piece. It's set in the Depression era, and it will play in 2024 for that reason. That's one of the great things about period pieces. It's another reason why Chariots of Fire, my all-time favorite movie, is now 43 years old, unbelievably. But because it's set almost like Titanic era, a little bit after that, it still plays. Because it's not current. You don't have 1981 hairstyles or styles of speech or anything like that. So I would say The Sting, fantastic movie. You absolutely will love it. Newman is so good. Redford is fucking phenomenal in that movie. And Robert Shaw, wow. Not the only movie. You know, in Jaws, when you think of Robert Shaw, you say, wow, wow. But I would say The Sting, number one. Butch Cassidy, I'm not so sure about. But I'll tell you what, the mystery thriller that I mentioned, his last leading role, Twilight, with Gene Hackman, who is never not great, Susan Sarandon, who really brings it in that movie, a young Liev Schreiber is in it, and Reese Witherspoon in a very important role as the daughter of Gene Hackman and Susan Sarandon's showbiz characters. They're both, you know, very successful actor, actress. Hackman's character is, you know, not doing well physically. But that's a movie, oh, and James Garner. AKA the old guy from The Notebook. Guaranteed you'll enjoy that film. It's not one of the great mysteries or great thrillers. It's not as good as the private eye movies that Newman made in the 60s, where he played the character Lou Harper. Harper and the Drowning Pool was the second version, or the second movie with this character, Harper. But I recommend Twilight. And if you haven't seen Road to Perdition, if you have any, if you like Tom Hanks, absolutely a terrific gangster film. Really good, brilliantly acted, and so beautifully shot, man. Sam Mendes, say what you will, he's had some ups and downs, maybe, you didn't like American Beauty. I'm not a fan of it. Road to Perdition is another one of those movies where so many individual shots could be a painting on the wall. They're so gorgeously composed. That's talent. Mendes has got it. But those really are the movies. Now, if you like courtroom thrillers or courtroom dramas, yes, The Verdict, 100%. And, that's pretty much it. He had an unbelievable career going back to the 50s that he was still grinding them out. Somebody up there likes me, 1956. And here's Paul, 45 plus years later, getting an Oscar nomination for Road to Perdition. He never stopped working. He never stopped trying to improve his craft, and never stopped giving. And because of the foundation and the product line continuing, he's still giving millions and millions of dollars to the less fortunate. And that was his whole life's purpose. His whole life's purpose was to give the hand to those in need. And that's how he lived his life. And it's not an exaggeration to say Paul Leonard Newman was a great man. And not just, by Hollywood standards. No, nothing to do with Hollywood standards. Newman was a great man, plain and simple. He did so much good when he could have simply made a shit ton of money and won a lot of awards and been a nice guy on movie sets, because there's nothing wrong with that. But he went above and beyond the above and beyond to become a different kind of legend, and to where his legacy is more of how much giving he did, how much he cared about others and not just himself, his immediate comforts, but the comforts of others. And with that, we've reached the end of episode 69 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast, the Paul Newman episode in honor of his 99th birthday in memoriam. If you checked out this Paul Newman episode on the YouTube channel and you haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, turn on the notifications. Or if you're listening to this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, or even Google Podcasts, you enjoy the content and haven't yet clicked like, subscribe, please do so. I'll be back real soon with episode number 70. Signing off from a rainy Friday night in New York. Peace.